All right. So getting started with Enoch, obviously there's not a lot that we have recorded about Enoch. His name pops up regarding the Enoch that we're talking about tonight about 10 times in the Bible. Most of them are genealogies. So there's very little in terms of background about him. But before we get into what we do know, there's a little bit of lineages that I want to look at between Genesis chapter 4 and Genesis chapter 5. If you did any kind of pre-study or looking at some of what's written about Enoch in chapter 5, there's also an Enoch mentioned in Genesis chapter 4. These are not the same Enochs. So there was an Enoch born. He was apparently Cain's first son. He named Enoch. That is not the same Enoch that we're talking about tonight. But if you go through that genealogy of Cain's children and you compare that to Seth's children in Genesis chapter 5, some people become confused because there are similar names listed in those two genealogies. And some have suggested, well, maybe there was some overlap there. But we're talking about male children, and as the genealogies went through the males. So I don't think there's any overlap, but we do see it is interesting. You've got Irad or Irid being born to Cain, and then Canaan being born to Seth. But then you have Mehujael versus Mahalalel. But these are two different Hebrew names. These aren't the same name, just spelled differently. These are two different Hebrew names. And, you got to figure that as Cain's bearing children, certain representations, of course, in the Old Testament, names held certain meanings. Okay, so it makes sense that there would be some overlap of meanings of names, not just naming a child a name because you like the sound of the name. There were certain meanings that were associated with them. Then you had Methushael and Methuselah, which are similar sounding, but again, two different names in the Hebrew. So Genesis chapter 4, after Methushael, then you have Lamech. Now, Lamech is the only one that's spelled the same between Genesis 4 and Genesis 5, but it sounds like we're talking about two different Lamechs. The Lamech of Genesis chapter 4, again, of the genealogy of Cain, apparently killed a man. We see that at the end of Genesis chapter 4. And it's also listed there that the way it's listed, it almost sounds chronological, as if after this, Adam and Eve had another son named Seth. Whether or not it's chronological or simply Moses, as this is being recorded. Meanwhile, while Cain's lineage is expanding, Adam and Eve had Seth, and now here's Seth's lineage, chapter 5. But regardless, there's obviously differences in genealogy. You've got Jared and then Enoch on Seth's side. Enoch was the father of Methuselah, and then Methuselah gave birth to Lamech, and Lamech gave birth to whom? In Genesis chapter 5. Anybody know? Noah. Yeah, Noah. And that's what kind of introduces the situation with Noah and the ark and so forth. So just kind of wanted to cover that in case anybody had any confusion or wondering if there were some overlaps. Obviously, among daughters, there might be some overlap somewhere along the way with some of those families, because there's not a lot of other options after after Cain and Seth. That there's nothing else. So certainly, I'm sure there was some overlap somewhere. But in terms of the actual genealogies, these are different people being described. So, going to Genesis chapter 5, and in verse 21, we're introduced to Enoch. After Enoch was born of Jared, we see that Enoch, verse 21, lived 65 years and begot Methuselah. And after he begot Methuselah, verse 22, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had sons and daughters. Verse 23. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. All right. So interesting phraseology, especially here in Genesis, at the beginning of Genesis, the idea of Enoch walked with God. It's mentioned twice. He walked with God 300 years, verse 22. And then it says, all the days of Enoch were 365, and Enoch walked with God. So twice this phrase, Enoch walked with God, comes up. Also Methuselah, most of us are familiar with Methuselah. He was the oldest man that we know of that ever lived. His listed years are 969 years. However, based on the timeline, how do you suppose Methuselah may have died? Flood. Yeah, that's what it sounds like. If you do the math, it looks as if Methuselah, as well as Lamech for that matter, assuming he didn't, it sounds like he died as well in the flood. So Enoch, it's interesting, over and over we have examples of faithful, godly people, and then for some reason their children or their grandchildren completely turn away from God. And so it's interesting that Enoch walked with God, and he was taken, it says, but then after that, Methuselah and Lamech presumably both died in the flood. So it's kind of an interesting situation that Noah and his family were righteous and faithful, whereas Methuselah doesn't seem like he was. All right. Any questions here in Genesis chapter 5? We're actually going to pick back up as to he was not, for God took him, here in verse 24. Okay, we're going to talk about that a little bit more here in just a minute. In Luke chapter 3 and in verse 37, we find Enoch listed as part of the genealogy of Christ, which is to say that obviously Noah was not of the family of Cain, but of the family of Seth. So then Jesus being of Noah, obviously that lineage would go through Enoch. But that's one other area where Enoch is mentioned, at least in the New Testament. All right, so the other times where Enoch is mentioned is Jude verse 14. Jude verse 14, and this is kind of an interesting reference. Jude makes mention of Enoch in the context of being a prophet. And this, of course, is similar to the type of context that Peter deals with in 2 Peter chapter 2. Some of these elements of individuals and what they're teaching and the types of lifestyles that they're telling people, you can live and be godly, just live your life how you want to and so forth, which obviously is not the case. But it seems like there's a lot of overlap in the types of things that Jude describes and what Peter describes. And so here in verse 12 and 13, he's describing these individuals and their character. And then in verse 14, now Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men also, saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment on all, to convict all who are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds, which they have committed in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Now, obviously, we don't have this recorded for us in the book of Genesis. It does come up in some other writings, both associated with the Old Testament and with Jewish writings and so forth. But the fact that Jude quotes it, and Jude is inspired of the Holy Spirit, can we bank on the fact that at some point Enoch must have said this or written it? I would say so. Okay, I would say that since Jude writes this, Jude says this is what Enoch said, then Enoch actually did say this. So there must have been some form of continuing evidence that this was said by Enoch or something along the lines of that understanding in the history, knowing that. And of course, Jude, he's not just borrowing this from somebody else. He's being inspired of the Holy Spirit to write this. So Enoch did say this, but he prophesied about these men. Now, not necessarily specifically these individuals themselves, but the character of these men seems to be specifically what Enoch is referencing. Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment on all, which is to say, what is Enoch prophesying about? Sorry? The coming of the Lord, yeah, and the coming of judgment upon all those who are evil. That's why he says to convict all who are godly among them for ungodly deeds and so forth. And of course, the 10,000s of his saints isn't so much a reference to here are the saints coming with the Lord to kill evildoers or to convict them or condemn them. It's that the example of all of these saints, the faith that they had, the character that they had to serve God, it carries with that weight of of conviction compared to these individuals who are ungodly with their ungodly deeds and ungodly ways and ungodly sinners. So obviously Enoch, rather, even as of the seventh from Adam, there was an understanding that God would bring all evil individuals to account, okay, to judgment. Now again, how that information came to Enoch, again, we're told he walked with God. Whether or not that included God revealed certain elements as to what the end was going to be in terms of Judgment Day or something like that. We don't know exactly what that was about. However, given the fact that even the Old Testament, there's continual references and understanding that God will bring all evil to account, I wouldn't be at all surprised if the law that Adam and Eve received after they were kicked out of the garden, which included sacrifices, we know that from from Cain and Abel, I wouldn't be at all surprised if there were some elements included in that law that understood or recognized that God would bring all to account as well. All right, any thoughts through Jude 14?
Similar phrase used back in Deuteronomy 33 about God coming with 10,000 of his saints. So this is a similar kind of expression used by Moses in that particular case.
Right, and that may have been Moses either paraphrasing Enoch or simply repeating the same thing that God had revealed to Enoch. You're absolutely right. It's not verbatim, but it is very similar. That phrase 10,000 of his saints and so forth is used back in Deuteronomy as well. Yeah. Okay, we pick up with Genesis chapter 5 again. He walked with God, it's mentioned twice. And then in Hebrews chapter 11 and in verse 5, he's famously mentioned by the Hebrew writer as being part of the chapter, what we call the chapter of faith. Hebrews chapter 11 and in verse 5, by faith Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death and was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. So, we kind of give a little bit, or the New Testament gives us a little bit of background or context to understand what that phrase means in Genesis chapter 5 about he was not, for God took him, okay, or he was taken. So, that being the case, let's kind of look at this a little bit more in terms of some of our questions here. What does it mean that Enoch walked with God? What does that mean, that he walked with God? Okay, so he was a faithful servant to God. Does it mean he was perfect? Because some have suggested that what this means is that he didn't sin at all, ever. And so God had to take him, otherwise the Messiah, there would be one exception in the reason why Jesus, when he came and broke the bonds of sin, well, the only one that didn't apply to would have been Enoch. Is that what this is saying, that he was perfect in his life?
No more than David was the friend of God was perfect. He wasn't either. It's just an expression.
Okay, an expression to show the devotion and the commitment that Enoch had in his service to God. And it stands out because no one else in the Old Testament genealogies is referred to this way, obviously before Noah. Okay, no one else. And so the fact that Enoch is spoken of this way suggests that he, perhaps above all others, sought to serve God, had the kind of commitment and devotion to serving God than many of the others of his time. For that matter, many of the others of all of those hundreds of years. Okay? So, what does it mean that God took him and was not? He did not die. Okay, and the Hebrew writer helps us understand that he did not see death, for God took him. Now, we can speculate all day as to why God took Enoch. Okay? What is one possibility, given what is to come in a couple hundred years?
He would have been part of the 7 that...
Well, yeah, or the 8. The 8 total. Yeah, the flood would have been coming in a couple hundred years after Enoch. Now, it's possible Enoch would have died long before that anyway, but that is one possibility. But regardless, this is a very rare occurrence that someone is taken and not seen death. In fact, who in the Bible are the only ones not to die? Sorry? What happened to Elijah? Which one was it? Was it the chariot or was it the wind? This is one of those that commonly kind of catches people up a little bit. Remember, the chariot was sent for him, but Elijah didn't want to go yet. Okay, and then later he was taken up in a whirlwind. All right, but the chariot was sent for him, but Elijah was able to stay a little bit longer. It doesn't sound like it was too much longer, but then eventually a whirlwind came to take him into heaven. So Elijah and Enoch are the only two that did not die in the as far as we know, in the history of mankind that is recorded for us. Okay, everyone else has died. Now, does that mean that Enoch and Elijah are literally in heaven right now, or are they in paradise, Hades, the realm of the dead? Thanks, Dwayne. I would posit that they were allowed to go into Hades, the realm of the dead. Okay, that's where all souls go, waiting for judgment. If they were in heaven right now, there would be some issues with the fact that, in the New Testament, no one has seen God. Of course, that could be speaking literally in terms of the physical, but also the fact that heaven is the ultimate reward after judgment. Now, if God wanted to, could he let him into heaven? Yeah, sure. Okay, but I would suggest that they're in the waiting place for all people. And of course, Elijah shows up later in the New Testament. What event was it where Elijah shows up? The Transfiguration. Yeah. Elijah shows up at the Transfiguration, and it doesn't appear that it was him in the flesh, like it wasn't his physical body. It doesn't sound like. Okay, you have a Moses, you have Elijah. They were recognizable. Okay, however it was that they were recognized, of course, Jesus certainly could have just pointed out, hey, this is Moses, this is Elijah. Say hello. But Elijah certainly would appear was in the spirit form or whatever, however you want to say that, as was Moses. It would seem. All right. Final question. What qualities do we find in Enoch that we should seek to emulate? Okay, he walked with God. He looked forward to the coming of the Lord. He understood that there was going to be a judgment of some kind. Okay, however expansive his information on that was. But then Hebrews 11 probably gives us the most in terms of his character, really all we need to know. Being listed in the chapter of faith, by faith, Enoch was taken up into heaven. And what testimony did he have? He pleased God. Okay, under the law that he was given by which he was to serve God, he was a person of faith. He pleased God in all that he did, and he sought to do everything that God commanded. And is that any different than us? No, we're under different law than Enoch had, but certainly that character of faith, and this is part of the reason Hebrews chapter 11 is such a wonderful chapter to look to, is that no matter what law individuals had, the people of faith have always had the same character of seeking to please God. That has been fundamental. It's completely consistent from Enoch all the way through. All right, anything else through Enoch? Any questions or thoughts? Yes, sir.
Well, two things. First, let me correct what I missaid a while ago. David was not called a friend of God. Abraham was. David was the man
After God's own heart.
So my bad on that.
Yeah.
My point so far. But secondarily, back to Enoch. From Jude, the verse we had referenced, we can't be like him in the sense of having miraculous information from God to prophesy future events.
That's true.
But we can be prophets in the other sense that prophets were prophets.
Of teaching God's
They
word.
were the mouthpiece for God and bringing a message. Even the message that he brings, though it is a future tense kind of thing, it's a warning which we can certainly give to people now. So in that limited sense, we can be like him.
Well, and not only that, but imagine, I mean, the type of society it would seem Enoch lived in, that similar to Lot, kind of living with sin and wickedness around him, similar to Noah eventually. I mean, it's only him, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives. Everyone else in that society were wicked. Okay, so imagine Enoch trying to explain this. Apparently he did at some point, tried to explain that there is a judgment coming. And it sounds like a warning. Okay, it certainly should have been. People didn't listen, it doesn't seem like. All right, that's it for Enoch. Next week we will cover Rahab. Those notes are on the back table, or on the table in the foyer. So pick those up. I'll also email those out tonight. Thanks, everybody.